Stonybrook, when viewed from the small hill above the parish church, always gave the impression of having been arranged, rather than built. The cottages clustered around the green as if a careful hand had placed them there. The brook that lent the village its name wound through it with almost deliberate charm, and even the smoke rising from chimneys seemed to hesitate before drifting into the pale English sky, as though unsure whether to disturb the peace below. It was the sort of village that outsiders described as quaint, and the villagers themselves tolerated that word with mild amusement. They knew, of course, that beneath the lace-curtained windows and well-swept paths, life was as tangled and complicated as anywhere else. It was only better hidden. On a bright morning in late spring, Stonybrook was preparing for its annual church fete, an event that had grown over the years from a modest cake stall and tombola into a full-scale social occasion. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Evelyn Cartwright, had taken charge of the planning with a determination that bordered on military precision, and it was widely understood that nothing short of death itself would be allowed to disrupt her schedule. It was perhaps unfortunate, therefore, that death was already making its way towards Stonybrook, though no one yet recognized its footsteps. Miss Jane Marple arrived in the village just after 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning, stepping down from the little bus with the careful patience of someone who had never been in a hurry, and saw no reason to begin now. She wore her usual neat hat, pinned securely against the faint spring breeze, and carried a small wicker basket which contained wool, a pair of knitting needles, and a modest packet of seedless grapes for her luncheon. She paused on the pavement outside the general store, and observed the village with mild approval. Stonybrook had the sort of orderliness she liked. Order, she often thought, was a comforting thing. It reassured one that even if people were not always as they should be, they were at least pretending to be so. "Good morning, Miss Marple." The greeting came from Mr. Edmund Lacey, the village postmaster, who emerged from his shop with the enthusiasm of a man who considered every conversation a small civic duty. "Good morning, Mr. Lacey," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "You've come just in time for the fete preparations," he said. "Busy week ahead. Busy. Everyone's in a flutter, especially at the vicarage." "I am not surprised," Miss Marple said. "These events always require a great deal of energy." "Ah, it's more than energy this year," Mr. Lacey said, lowering his voice with relish. "There's been, well, a change. New people staying at the manor, and you know how that stirs things up." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly, though her expression remained gentle. "The manor," she repeated. "Crochet Manor," Mr. Lacey said. "Belongs to Mrs. Lillian Whitmore. She's renting it out at the moment. Wealthy lady, though rather private. She's taken in a guest, a Mr. Alan Redfern. No one quite knows who he is. That is often the case with guests," Miss Marple observed. "Yes, but there's something odd," Mr. Lacey insisted. "He hardly leaves the house. And when he does, people say he looks as though he's counting his steps." Miss Marple gave a soft, thoughtful nod. "People do that sometimes when they are anxious," she said. "I suppose so," Mr. Lacey agreed, though he did not sound entirely convinced. "Still, the vicar's wife says she doesn't want gossip before the fete. Says it's bad for the cake stall." "Quite right," Miss Marple said gravely. "Cake is a very serious matter." Crochet Manor stood half a mile beyond the village, set back among overgrown hedges, and an old orchard that had long since ceased producing anything except memories. It was a Georgian house, once elegant, now gently faded, as though time had decided to soften its edges, rather than erase it entirely. Inside, this atmosphere was rather different from the village calm. Mrs. Lillian Whitmore sat in the drawing-room with a letter in her hand. She was a tall woman, carefully dressed, with the composed expression of someone who had learned long ago not to show surprise easily. Yet the hand holding the letter betrayed a faint tension. Across from her stood Mr. Alan Redfern. He was not, at first glance, remarkable. He might have been any man of 35 or 40, neatly dressed, quiet in manner, with an air of restraint that suggested he was perpetually aware of something just out of sight. His gaze drifted often to the window, where the garden lay overgrown and slightly wild. "You understand, of course," Mrs. Whitmore said, folding the letter with deliberate precision, "that this arrangement cannot continue indefinitely." "I understand," Mr. Redfern replied calmly. "You were meant to stay only until things were settled." "They are not settled," he said. A silence followed. Outside, a bird called sharply, as if irritated by the weather or the world in general. Mrs. Whitmore stood and walked to the fireplace, though no fire burned there. "You have been seen," she said quietly. "In the village. That is unwise." "I was careful," he replied. "Careful people are still noticed." Mr. Redfern allowed himself a faint, humorless smile. "In a place like this," he said, "people notice everything eventually." Mrs. Whitmore turned back to him. "You must leave after the fete," she said firmly. "It will be safer then. The village will be distracted, and if I refuse—" For the first time her composure faltered slightly. "Then I will have to reconsider my position entirely," she said. Something in the way she said it suggested that position did not refer merely to hospitality. Mr. Redfern inclined his head. "Very well," he said, "after the fete." But when he said it, he did not sound like a man agreeing. He sounded like a man marking time. Miss Marple's first visit to Crochet Manor was not as planned. She had intended only to walk along the lane to the churchyard, where the early roses were beginning to show themselves. But on the way, she encountered Miss Lucy Cartwright, daughter of the vicar's wife, who was returning from delivering program leaflets with a flushed and slightly agitated expression. "Oh, Miss Marple," Lucy exclaimed. "Are you going to the manor?" "I had not intended to," Miss Marple replied. "Why do you ask?" "Well," Lucy said, lowering her voice instinctively, "Mother says we mustn't talk about it. But there's a man staying there. Very strange, and Mrs. Whitmore is acting oddly. Even for her." "In what way oddly?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lucy hesitated. "She came to the vicarage yesterday," she said. "Offered a very large donation for the fete. Said she wanted everything to go perfectly. But she kept looking over her shoulder, as if she thought someone might be listening." Miss Marple considered this. "And the gentleman?" she prompted. "Oh, him," Lucy said. "No one quite knows what to make of him. He walked past the church last week and stopped just to look at the clock tower for a very long time. Mrs. Cartwright said it was not the behavior of a normal tourist." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People often assume there is such a thing as a normal tourist," she said. Lucy laughed nervously, though she still looked uneasy. "I don't like it," she admitted. "Something about the house feels wrong." "That is a very interesting word," Miss Marple said softly. "Wrong can mean many things. Sometimes it means dangerous. Sometimes it means merely unfamiliar." They reached the manor gates as they spoke. The ironwork was ornate but rusting, and the gravel drive beyond was uneven, as though it had forgotten the purpose of being maintained. Lucy hesitated. "You'll come in with me, won't you?" she asked. Miss Marple paused only a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think I shall." Mrs. Whitmore received them with polite surprise that did not quite conceal irritation. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" she said, after Lucy's hurried introductions. "I believe I've heard of you, only in connection with gardening and gossip." Miss Marple replied pleasantly. A faint flicker passed across Mrs. Whitmore's face, something like amusement, or perhaps recognition. "How very reassuring," she said. Mr. Redfern appeared at the door of the drawing-room a moment later. When he saw Miss Marple, his expression changed almost imperceptibly, like a man who had been expecting a storm and was unsure whether it had already arrived. "Ah," he said quietly, "guests." Miss Marple studied him with the calm attention she reserved for knitting patterns and human beings alike. There was nothing overtly alarming about him. Yet she had lived long enough to know that danger did not always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it arrived quietly, like dust settling on a mantelpiece. "How do you do?" she said. "Very well," he replied. "Under the circumstances." "And what circumstances are those?" she asked gently. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Whitmore interjected briskly. "We are preparing for the fete," she said. "As you may know, I'm afraid we are rather busy." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "So is everyone in the village. It is a most important event." Mr. Redfern gave a short, almost imperceptible laugh. "Yes," he said, "important things often are." The way he said it lingered in the air slightly too long. That evening, as the sun lowered itself behind the hedgerows and Stonybrook settled into its usual gentle twilight, Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the village. The sound of distant laughter drifted from the green, where children were practicing stalls for the fete, and somewhere a dog barked at nothing in particular. Yet her thoughts were not on cakes or flowers or village festivities. They were on a man who counted his steps, a woman who watched her own shadow, and a house that felt very faintly, as though it was holding its breath. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the lane and looked back once toward Crochet Manor. The windows were lit now, warm and inviting from a distance, but she had learned long ago that warm light could conceal very cold intentions indeed. "I wonder," she said softly to herself, "what exactly is being prepared for this fete?" And with that thought, she continued on her way, while behind her, unseen in the manor's upper window, a curtain moved ever so slightly, as though someone had just stepped back from watching her go. By the following morning, Stonybrook had acquired a new topic of conversation, as villages so often did, and it spread with the quiet efficiency of water seeping through stone. It began, as such things often did, at the post office. "Did you hear?" Mr. Lacey said, leaning forward with theatrical importance as he handed Miss Marple her parcel of knitting wool. "There was a visitor at Crochet Manor last night. Late visitor. Arrived after 10. Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "A motor car. Very expensive looking. Sat outside for nearly 20 minutes. Then it went away again without lights." "That is curious," Miss Marple agreed. "And Mrs. Whitmore has told the vicarage she is cancelling her full contribution to the fete," he added triumphantly, as though this were the most scandalous detail of all. "Changed her mind overnight. Says she is feeling unwell." Miss Marple paused. "That is a rather convenient kind of illness," she observed. Mr. Lacey nodded vigorously. "Exactly what I said." Miss Marple smiled faintly and thanked him before continuing on her way. But as she walked, her thoughts were already knitting themselves together, in a pattern not unlike the one she held in her basket. Small threads of behavior, tone, hesitation, and omission. People, she knew, rarely changed their minds without reason. More often they changed them because something had changed their fear. At 11 o'clock she called upon the vicarage. Mrs. Cartwright received her in the drawing room, where pamphlets for the fete lay arranged in precise stacks, as though even paper required discipline. "I'm so glad you've come, Miss Marple," she said at once. "Lucy told me you visited Crochet Manor yesterday." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I hope that was not improper." "Improper," Mrs. Cartwright said briskly. "In Stonybrook? Nothing is improper if it prevents trouble, though I do wish I knew what sort of trouble we are dealing with." "That is often the difficulty with trouble," Miss Marple said. "It rarely introduces itself properly." Mrs. Cartwright gave a short, humorless laugh. "Quite," she said. "Well, I shall be direct. There is something very strange about Mrs. Whitmore. She was extremely generous, almost alarmingly so, and now she has withdrawn everything overnight." "That does suggest a change of circumstances," Miss Marple said. "Or a change of conscience," Mrs. Cartwright replied sharply. At that moment Lucy entered with tea, and set the tray down with more force than was strictly necessary. "It's not just Mrs. Whitmore," Lucy said. "It's him." "The gentleman staying with her?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," Lucy said. "Mr. Redfern. I saw him again yesterday evening near the churchyard. He was standing by the old war memorial, just staring at the names. That is not, in itself, suspicious," Miss Marple said gently. Lucy flushed. "No, but the way he looked, as if he recognized them, as if they meant something to him personally." Miss Marple accepted her tea thoughtfully. "People often project meaning onto names carved in stone," she said, "especially in places like this, where memory is, well, communal." Mrs. Cartwright frowned. "You are not convinced there is anything wrong?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "I am not yet convinced of anything," she said. "But I am, as always, interested." Lucy hesitated. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Last night, just after the motorcar left Crochet Manor, the church bell rang. Once. Just once. But no one was ringing it." A silence followed this statement. Mrs. Cartwright stiffened. "That is impossible," she said firmly. "The bell rope is secured after evening prayers." "And yet it rang," Lucy insisted. Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Then someone must have entered the tower," she said. Her tone was calm, but something in it sharpened slightly. "And that would require a key," Mrs. Cartwright added slowly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Or familiarity." Later that afternoon Miss Marple walked to the church. The building stood slightly apart from the village, as churches often did, as though maintaining a polite distance from everyday life. The graveyard sloped gently around it, dotted with old stones softened by weather and time. She did not go inside at first. Instead, she stood by the war memorial. The names were neatly engraved, many repeated across generations. She ran her eyes slowly over them, as Lucy had described, and then paused. One name seemed to draw her attention more than the others, Private Alan Redfern. She studied it for a long moment. Then she turned away, her expression unchanged, though her thoughts had become considerably more active. A coincidence, she thought, was always possible. But coincidences had a habit of behaving like company, more convincing when they arrived in groups. Crochet Manor that evening was unusually still. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb it. Miss Marple was admitted by a housemaid who looked faintly anxious, as though she had been instructed not to admit anyone at all, and was now quietly regretting her obedience. Mrs. Whitmore received her in the drawing room again, but the atmosphere had altered. The curtains were half drawn, though the light outside was still strong, and the air felt closer, more restrained. "You are persistent, Miss Marple," Mrs. Whitmore said. "I am merely observant," Miss Marple replied. "Observant people are dangerous," Mrs. Whitmore said before she could stop herself. A brief silence followed. From somewhere deeper in the house came the faint sound of movement, footsteps perhaps, or a door closing too carefully. "I am told you have cancelled your contribution to the fete," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Mrs. Whitmore said shortly. "I have changed my mind, because of Mr. Redfern." For the first time Mrs. Whitmore's composure fractured. "You should not speak that name so freely," she said. "Why not?" Miss Marple asked gently. "It is a very ordinary name." "It is not ordinary," Mrs. Whitmore said sharply. "Not here." There was a pause. Then Miss Marple said, almost conversationally, "I visited the church today." Mrs. Whitmore went still. "Did you?" she asked carefully. "And I noticed a name on the war memorial." Mrs. Whitmore did not speak. "A Private Alan Redfern," Miss Marple continued. "Which is interesting, because Mr. Redfern is currently alive." A faint sound escaped Mrs. Whitmore, something between a laugh and a breath. "You are mistaken," she said. "I rarely am," Miss Marple replied kindly. For a moment, the room felt as though it had tightened around them. Then the door opened. Mr. Redfern stepped inside. He looked at Miss Marple, then at Mrs. Whitmore, and something unspoken passed between them, quick, sharp, and exhausted. "So," he said quietly, "you have discovered it." "I have discovered a name," Miss Marple corrected. "Names are often very revealing." He gave a faint nod, as though conceding the point. "I am not a ghost," he said. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "I did not think you were." Mrs. Whitmore exhaled slowly. "Then you understand nothing," she said. "I understand," Miss Marple replied, "that someone is afraid of what a name might reveal." That night, the village heard the second bell, twice this time, and this time, it was followed by something far more alarming, a scream. Miss Marple arrived at Crochet Manor to find the front door open, and the house in disarray. Lamps had been knocked slightly askew, and a chair lay overturned near the staircase. In the drawing room, Mrs. Whitmore stood rigid, her face pale. "He is gone," she said. "Who is gone?" Miss Marple asked quietly. But before Mrs. Whitmore could answer, Lucy Cartwright burst into the house, breathless. "They found a body," she said. "In the churchyard," Mrs. Whitmore whispered. "Yes," Lucy said. "By the war memorial." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, not in shock, but in confirmation. And somewhere in the stillness that followed, she thought she finally understood why the bells had rung. Not as warning, but as memory refusing to stay buried. The churchyard was no longer the peaceful place it had been only a day before. By morning, Stonybrook had gathered at its edges in hesitant clusters, men with hats in their hands, women speaking in low, urgent tones, children unusually quiet, as though they understood instinctively that laughter did not belong here. The police had arrived from the nearest town, and with them a stiffness that changed the air of the village entirely. Inspector Harold Pritchard stood by the war memorial, his expression fixed in professional disapproval of both the situation and the weather. The body had already been removed, but the space where it had lain seemed, to Miss Marple, to retain something of its presence, not in any supernatural sense, but in the way human emotion imprints itself on places more stubbornly than footprints. Inspector Pritchard turned as she approached. "I understand you are Miss Marple," he said. "I am," she replied pleasantly. "I'm told you've been asking questions, only the sort of questions one asks when one is curious," Miss Marple said. He gave her a look that suggested curiosity was a habit he did not entirely trust. "Well," he said, "we've identified the deceased. Name: Alan Redfern." A silence followed this, but Miss Marple did not appear surprised. "Or at least," the inspector added, "that is the name on his documents. Wallet, letters, identification, papers, all in order." "Interesting," Miss Marple said softly. "Is it?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "Because it is not necessarily the same as truth." By mid-morning, rumors had begun to circulate through Stonybrook like restless birds. Some said Mr. Redfern had been a criminal hiding under a false identity. Others said he had been a war deserter. One particularly imaginative theory, voiced by Mr. Lacey, suggested espionage, though he could not specify for which side or war. At the vicarage, Mrs. Cartwright was in a state of controlled alarm. "If there is a murderer in this village," she declared, "we must know who it is before the fete." "Mother," Lucy said weakly. That seems a little practical, her mother finished firmly. Cake cannot compete with murder. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly in a corner of the drawing room, knitting with unhurried rhythm, though her eyes were very much awake. You are very calm about this, Inspector Pritchard remarked. I have found, Miss Marple said gently, that excitement rarely improves clarity. He grunted. We believe he was struck late last night near the memorial, he said. Blunt force trauma, no weapon found yet. And the bell? Miss Marple asked. The inspector frowned. What bell? The church bell, she said. It rang twice. According to several witnesses, that could be anyone, he said dismissively. Wind, mechanical fault, prank. Miss Marple said nothing, but her expression suggested she did not consider wind especially clever at ringing bells twice in a meaningful sequence. Later that afternoon she returned to Crochet Manor. The house was quieter now, as though it had exhausted its ability to react. Mrs. Whitmore received her in a drawing room stripped of its earlier tension, only because tension had been replaced by exhaustion. Mr. Redfern's absence was noticeable in the way an unfinished sentence is noticeable in conversation. You think I am responsible, Mrs. Whitmore said without preamble. I think. You are afraid, Miss Marple replied. That is not the same thing. No, Miss Marple agreed. It is not. Mrs. Whitmore turned away. You do not understand what he was, she said. Then help me understand, Miss Marple said gently. A long pause followed. When Mrs. Whitmore finally spoke, her voice was lower. His name was not Redfern, she said. That much you have already guessed. Yes, Miss Marple said. He was someone who was meant to be dead, Mrs. Whitmore continued, years ago, during the war. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet, she said, he was not. Mrs. Whitmore's hands tightened. There was confusion, she said. Records lost. Men declared dead who were not. It happens. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. It does. He came here because of it, Mrs. Whitmore said. Because he found out what his supposed death had done for him legally. A new identity had been built. A life built on his absence. And that life, Miss Marple said quietly, belonged to someone else. Mrs. Whitmore did not answer directly. You do not know what people become when their lives are taken and given back incorrectly, she said instead. He wanted to expose it. To whom? Miss Marple asked. That is the problem, Mrs. Whitmore said bitterly. To everyone. Inspector Pritchard, meanwhile, had found another lead. A motorcar had been reported near Crochet Manor on the night of the death. The driver, a man from a neighboring village, admitted he had been hired to wait outside the manor and collect a passenger who never arrived. He described the passenger only vaguely, a woman in a dark coat. At this, suspicion turned inevitably toward Mrs. Whitmore. She had motive, the inspector said bluntly. She was involved in something irregular regarding Redfern's identity. She may have panicked. Miss Marple listened without comment. And the bell? She asked again. Still irrelevant, he said firmly. But Miss Marple did not think so. People rarely rang church bells in moments of panic, she reflected. Panic tended to produce noise, yes, but not structured noise. A bell required intention. That evening, Lucy Cartwright arrived at Miss Marple's lodging in a state of agitation. I saw something, she said breathlessly. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Something important, she asked. I think so, Lucy said. I went back to the churchyard. I shouldn't have, but I did. And? There was someone there, Lucy said. At the memorial. Digging. Miss Marple set down her needles. Digging, she repeated. Yes, Lucy said, but not digging into the ground. Into the base of the memorial itself, as if looking for something hidden. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. Did you see who it was? Lucy hesitated. It was dark, she said, but I think it was Mr. Lacey. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something in her attention shifted. The postmaster? She asked. Lucy nodded. He ran when I shouted, she said. Just left whatever he was doing and ran. Miss Marple rose slowly. That, she said softly, is most interesting. By midnight, Stonybrook had acquired a new layer of unease. Inspector Pritchard dismissed Lucy's claim as confusion born of stress. But Miss Marple did not dismiss things so easily. Mr. Lacey, she thought, was a man who knew everything that passed through the village. Letters, secrets, notices, whispers, he handled them all. A man in such a position often became invisible by virtue of being constantly present. The kind of person people stopped seeing, except when they needed to. And now there was a war memorial, a dead man with a living identity. a bell that rang without hands, and a postmaster who dug where he should not. Miss Marple stood by her window, looking out at the sleeping village. Somewhere in it, she felt, a secret had been buried twice, once in the ground, and once in the minds of everyone who had agreed not to notice it. And that second burial, she knew from experience, was always the more dangerous. The morning broke over Stonybrook with an uneasy clarity, as though the sky itself had decided to reveal rather than conceal. The churchyard was cordoned off more strictly now, and Inspector Pritchard's patience had worn into something sharper around the edges. Miss Marple arrived just as the inspector was supervising the removal of soil from the base of the war memorial. "What exactly are we hoping to find?" he asked, not without irritation. "Only what has been hidden," Miss Marple replied. "That could be anything," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "That is why people hide things there." A workman called out, and a small metal box was lifted from beneath the memorial's foundation. It was old, rusted, and carefully sealed. Inspector Pritchard stepped forward immediately. "Open it," he ordered. Inside were documents, not many, but enough. Miss Marple did not touch them. She merely leaned slightly to see. Birth records, a military record, a declaration of death followed by a correction that had never been officially filed, and a series of letters. The inspector scanned them quickly. "This is administrative nonsense," he said. "War record confusion, bureaucratic error. It is identity," Miss Marple said quietly. He looked at her sharply. "What?" "This man," she said, indicating the papers, "was declared dead in error during the war. But someone ensured that error was never corrected officially, which meant his identity could be reassigned." The inspector frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Why would anyone do that?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted slightly toward the village beyond the church gate. "Because," she said gently, "identity is sometimes more valuable than money." That afternoon, the pieces began to fall into place, not dramatically, but with the quiet inevitability of a pattern finally recognized. Mr. Lacey was brought in for questioning. At first, he protested loudly. "I run the post office," he said indignantly. "I've served this village for 20 years, yes." Inspector Pritchard said flatly. "You have, very efficiently. That is hardly a crime." "No," Miss Marple said softly from the corner of the room, "but it is a position of extraordinary knowledge." Mr. Lacey turned to her sharply. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple." "I am not implying," she said. "I am observing." A silence fell. Then she continued. "You knew Alan Redfern," she said. "I knew of him," Lacey corrected quickly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Because his name passed through your hands before it passed through anyone else's. When he arrived in the village, when he wrote letters, when he requested information, when he began asking inconvenient questions about a death that was supposed not to exist." Pritchard frowned. "You're saying he was investigating his own identity?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And that is always dangerous, because identities, once built, rarely like being dismantled." Mr. Lacey laughed sharply. "So what? You think I killed him to protect some paperwork?" Miss Marple looked at him with quiet sadness. "No," she said. "I think you killed him because he discovered you had built your life on someone else's absence." The room went still. Even Inspector Pritchard stopped writing. Later, in Miss Marple's account, the truth emerged not as a single revelation but as a chain of small, almost ordinary decisions. Years earlier, during the war, a soldier named Alan Redfern had been declared killed in action. A clerical error common enough in wartime chaos had been quietly absorbed into record systems. But the error had consequences. The real Alan Redfern survived, and returned, only to discover that his death had already been settled legally, administratively, and socially. Insurance had been paid, property reassigned, records closed. And somewhere in the machinery of bureaucracy, someone had realized that a dead man who was actually alive was not just an inconvenience, but an opportunity. Mr. Lacey, working then in a military records office before returning to civilian life as postmaster, had seen it first, and understood what could be done with it. A new identity constructed from an old one. Documents corrected selectively. The living man quietly erased, the dead man made permanent. But Alan Redfern had returned, and begun to ask questions. Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Marple explained, was not the mastermind but the protector. She had been involved in assisting Lacey years ago, when her family estate had benefited indirectly from the legal confusion surrounding Redfern's death. She had known more than she should have known, and had lived since then, under the quiet burden of that knowledge. When Redfern reappeared, she recognized him instantly, and feared what he represented: exposure. The final confrontation took place not in the village, but at Crochet Manor, in the drawing room where the air had once felt merely heavy, and now felt final. Mr. Lacey stood by the fireplace, no longer indignant. Instead, he looked tired. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "People don't survive war cleanly. Everything gets rearranged. I didn't kill him for money." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "You killed him because he was proof that your arrangement could be undone." Inspector Pritchard stepped forward. "How?" he demanded. "How did you do it?" Lacey gave a faint, bitter smile. "The bell rope," he said. Lucy gave a small gasp. "I had access to the church," he continued. "I knew the tower. I knew he would be there alone, looking at that memorial like it meant something personal. He always did that." "And the blow?" the inspector asked. "A length of iron from the maintenance shed," Lacey said simply. "Very ordinary, very useful." Mrs. Whitmore turned away, as though she could no longer bear to look at him. "And the memorial?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Why disturb it?" Lacey hesitated. "Because I thought he had hidden something there," he said. "Proof, documents, something that would destroy everything. But he hadn't," Miss Marple said. "No," Lacey admitted. "He hadn't." A silence fell. And in that silence, something like regret lingered, not for the act itself, but for the inevitability of it. Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. "You made a very common mistake," she said gently. Lacey looked at her. "What mistake?" "Believing that secrecy is stable," she replied. "It never is. It only waits." The village of Stonybrook did what villages always do after tragedy. It slowly resumed its shape. The fete went ahead, though with more restraint than originally planned. Cakes were still baked, raffles still drawn. Children still ran between stalls, though more quietly than usual, as if instinctively respecting something they could not name. Mr. Lacey was removed quietly, his long service acknowledged but not defended. Mrs. Whitmore withdrew from public life entirely. The war memorial was cleaned and restored. And Alan Redfern, once declared dead, then alive, then dead again, was finally recorded properly. His identity settled at last into the only form bureaucracy could fully accept: the truth, corrected. On the final afternoon of her stay, Miss Marple sat on a bench overlooking the green. Lucy joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. "I don't understand how you saw it all," Lucy said quietly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear," she said, "it is rarely about seeing everything. It is about noticing what does not fit comfortably." Lucy considered this. "The bell?" she asked. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "A bell does not ring by accident in a sequence. Once might be chance, twice is intention." "And Mr. Lacey, a man who knows every letter in a village," Miss Marple said, "also knows every secret carried within them. That is a very powerful position. People forget that power often hides in quiet places." Lucy looked down at her tea. "It feels strange," she said. "Everything going back to normal." Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. "It never goes back," she said. "It only moves forward, wearing familiar clothes." A pause. Then she added, almost to herself, "And sometimes," she said, "the most dangerous crimes are not committed in anger or greed, but in the belief that the past can be tidied away like paperwork." She stood, adjusting her gloves. The village looked peaceful again, carefully peaceful. But Miss Marple knew that peace was not the absence of secrets, only the temporary agreement to stop speaking of them. And as she walked away down the lane, Stonybrook behind her once again arranged itself into its familiar, gentle order, while somewhere beneath that order, memory settled quietly, like dust returning to shelves that would one day be disturbed again.